All right. Welcome to part 2 of the Progressive Era recorded lecture. I'm going to pick up where Mr. Blay left off, which I believe is right around sources of progressive reform. So, as part of the Progressive Era, of course, we have to look at labor unions and the impact of labor unions during this time. Working class Americans were some of the most unfairly treated members of the country, and they obviously were going to stick up for themselves, and they were always kind of, working against city bosses and tycoons and those who, were trying to suppress their rights. So we still have the AFL, or the American Federation of Labor, but we do see the creation of the Union Labor Party. And what was different about the Union Labor Party is that they actually wanted the governments to step in and start implementing change, asking for things like, workers' comp and less hours and labor laws. And they really wanted the government to be able to regulate these things, which was different than the AFL, who didn't really believe in government assistance and wanted it to be able to do everything on their own. The triangle of labor, the machine, and reform. When we're looking at workers' rights, we have to talk about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. And this was a fire that took place on the 8th and 9th floors of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And, two things had happened on this day that led to the deaths of over 140 young immigrant women. That the doors were locked in order to keep labor unrest out, as well as a rusted and non-working fire escape. So both of these things led to over 146 women either burning to their deaths or jumping to their deaths, and eventually, led to the rise of, people who were fighting for change in the workplace in New York. And it didn't happen overnight, but it did eventually, start to see some reform taking place. When it comes to the progressives in the West, this was focused on the federal government. And the reason the federal government had to be so, the federal government had to be in charge of Western reform is that a lot of the changes that were taking place in the West were with actual physical landmarks, and oftentimes when it comes down to water, or who does this water belong to, or who does this land belong to, it's a state dispute. And if two states are disputing, it would go to the Supreme Court. So this would be a federal case jurisdiction. Also, most of the land in the West is owned by the federal government, which basically means that they needed the federal government's support to build up infrastructure. Okay, so one of the most important characteristics of the progressive era is African American reform, and some of the leaps and bounds that it took during this time period. Now, there's two men who advocated for African American reform: Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, Booker T. Washington, I'm actually going to go, so if you come to the bottom of the slide, we see that the Niagara movement started, and then eventually the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, is formed, and they wanted to use the federal court system. So how can they, use the courts and the Supreme Court to create permanent change? That is really the key, is permanent change, because without creating laws, the change isn't going to happen. You can talk about ideas all day, but until you create a law, the change isn't going to occur. Now, I want to talk about Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, but I'm going to go ahead and do that on the next slide. So you can see here in this kind of blurry and fuzzy Venn diagram that both Booker T. Washington and Du Bois were advocates for African American rights. Now, major difference, Booker T. was someone who was born into slavery, where Du Bois was born after slavery. Booker T. Washington really emphasizes the idea that blacks African Americans their goal should be to incorporate themselves into the economy. How can we make ourselves helpful? And, that he does too believe, kind of in the same mindset as Martin Luther King, is that compromise at times can be progress. If we can meet in the middle, then there is some progress to that. Where Du Bois is the opposite, is that blacks should, really work to be in their own sphere, in their own realm of success. So, that was definitely, different. And Booker T. Washington focuses on, incorporating yourself into the economy. He thinks that's what's important, which is why he creates organizations like the Tuskegee Institute, which would teach African Americans a skill that would make them necessary to be part of the American economy. So Du Bois believes in the top tenth and this idea that there are, groups of African Americans that are equal to and superior to many whites, and the focus needs to be put on them. So both really, really influential, and Du Bois is really a huge supporter of the NAACP, but they have different mindsets on how African Americans should be incorporated into society and into the economy. Another important reform that we can focus on is the Temperance Crusade. And this is obviously a continuity that we've talked about from the antebellum reform period, that women are still fighting for the banning of alcohol. They believe that if we eliminate alcohol, it will help eliminate societal problems. Some supporters of the Temperance Crusade are women, as obviously, husbands are coming home, they are intoxicated after work, or they're using the family's money to, partake in said drinking. Employers, they of course, as people are missing work because they were coming to work drunk or it was hurting their production from being drunk from the night before. And then political reformers also wanted to ban alcohol because bars were basically the centers for political machines. And this is where people were going to really get to, these political machines would be able to kind of mold the minds of their constituents and their voters to vote one way or another. A result of the Temperance Crusade is the formation of the Women's Christian Temperance Movement, or the WCTU, Women Christian Temperance Union, and it was the first official anti-saloon or anti-bar movement. And then eventually by 1916, the 18th Amendment, 1920, the 18th Amendment is passed by the U.S. Constitution, which prohibits the production, sale, or manufacturing of alcohol, which is then, of course, repealed in 1933 by the 21st Amendment during the Great Depression by FDR. Okay, so this comes back to another continuity. The immigration restriction is something that's going to continue. With the abundance of immigrants coming during the late 1800s. So some people, they thought that assimilation would help immigrants, but others thought the only solution to immigration was to limit immigration. And some of the new mindsets that come about are eugenics, and we've talked a little bit about eugenics, but basically it's the belief that justify a lot of the actions of the dictators in the 1930s. It's a practice that aims at improving the genetic quality of human population by basically just forcing sterilization for those who are not fit for society. So these are really extreme thoughts, but they are not going to really be put into action.